Okay, guys, today we're going to talk about solving equations by multiplying by the reciprocal. So these are going to be one and two-step equations that contain fractions, and we'll solve the last step by multiplying by the reciprocal. So let's start with just a quick refresher on solving one-step equations. When I solve a basic equation such as 4x equals 36, we solve by doing the opposite operation. To undo this 4 times x and get x by itself, we divide. We do the opposite operation, so we're going to divide both sides by 4. And we usually show it like a fraction. So when we do that, this 4 and this 4 cancel out, leaving an x on the left side. And then we do 36 over 4 and simplify that, which is 9. 36 over 4, or 36 divided by 4, equals 9. So my answer is x equals 9. We can do the same thing with fractions. So if I have, instead of a 4x, let's say I have a 1/3 x. So in this case, I have 1/3 x equals 12. We still divide, but I'm not going to show it like this because a fraction over a fraction is kind of messy. So when we have fractions, we'll show the actual division symbol. So we're still doing the opposite operation. This means 1/3 times x, so I'm going to divide both sides by 1/3. And I'm going to rewrite that. So when you have 1/3 divided by 1/3, they cancel out on the left side. And what I have on the right side is 12 divided by 1/3. The order that you write this in is really important since we're doing this horizontally, because that's how we typically divide fractions. You have to put the divided by sign and then the 1/3 in that order to show that we are actually dividing by 1/3. So that's important. And then a quick refresher on how to divide fractions. We want them both to be in fraction form, so I'm going to write this 12 over 1. And the way we do this is we do 12 over 1, and we change it to multiply by the reciprocal. So when we divide fractions, we don't actually divide. We change this to multiply by the reciprocal. Kind of like keep, change, change with integers. You keep the first one the same, change the division to multiplication, and change the second number to the reciprocal. And then I multiply. Multiplying fractions is just multiplying straight across. So I end up with 12 times 3 for the numerator and 1 for the denominator, but we don't usually write over 1. So we can just write 36 as our answer. So if you notice, what happened here is when I divided by 3, I ended up changing that to multiplying by the reciprocal, because that's what dividing by a fraction means. So we're going to kind of skip this step from now on. When we see this situation happen, where I have to divide by a fraction, I'm going to immediately think of, instead of divide by that fraction, instead of doing this step, we're going to multiply by the reciprocal, because that really means the same thing. That's how we divide fractions. We multiply by the reciprocal. So we're going to do a shortcut, basically. So here's another example. Let's say I have 4/5 x equals 1/6. So what I have to do here is divide by 4/5. But the shortcut is, since dividing by a fraction really means multiplying by the reciprocal, I'm going to, and you might want to write this in your notes, pause it, I'm going to multiply both sides by the reciprocal of 4/5. So instead of dividing by 4/5, I'm going to multiply both sides by the reciprocal. And you want to put parentheses around both those numbers. It makes it look a little bit cleaner. And you just put them side by side, because once you know that this is going to be multiplication, these cancel out. So over here, if you remember how to cross cancel, and if you don't, you might want to watch the previous video on multiplying, we can cancel a 4 here diagonally, and we can cancel these 5s diagonally. That's why this works. And I'm left with just my x. Everything else canceled out on the left. And on the right side, I'm doing 1/6 times 5/4, and you just multiply straight across for fractions. So 1 times 5 is 5. 6 times 4 is 24. You can always check, make sure you can't simplify that. And that's your answer if you can't simplify it. So when we are having to divide fractions in that last step, we're going to multiply by the reciprocal. We'll do one more example like that. Let's take 3/4 x equals 6. So I need to divide both sides in this step, but I'm not going to divide. I'm going to multiply by the reciprocal to cancel out this fraction. Whoops. Multiply by the reciprocal of 3/4, which is 4/3. Do the same thing on this side. And if you have a whole number, write it as over 1, because when we're multiplying fractions or dividing fractions, we want to see that as over 1. Over on this side, we can cross cancel all those 3's and 4's, so I'm left with just an x. And over on this side, I'm going to multiply straight across. So 6 times 4 gives me the numerator. 1 times 3 gives me the denominator. 24/3 is just 8. I could have also cross-canceled in this original problem. If you look diagonally, the 6 and the 3 can both be canceled. They can both be divided by 3, so we can simplify that right away. Divide that by 3, divide that by 3, and I would have gotten 8/1 immediately. Okay, so let's try this with a two-step equation. Two-step meaning I have, let's see, 1/2 x plus 5 equals 8. So this is a pretty simple two-step. So same thing, we're just going to go through the process that we normally do. We subtract 5. We have to get rid of the 5 first. The 5's cancel, and I'm left with 1/2 x equals 8 minus 5 gives me 3 on the right side. And this is the step where I multiply by the reciprocal. So you multiply both sides by the reciprocal of 1/2, which is 2/1. Write any whole numbers over 1. Here, the 1's and 2's cancel out. I'm left with just an x. And then I multiply straight across. So I get 6/1, but I don't have to write over 1. 3 times 2 is 6. That's my answer. Okay, one more two-step equation. 3/5 x minus 1/2 equals 3/4. So in this case, I'm going to have to still do the adding and subtracting, so I do the opposite operation, and I need to get rid of this 1/2 first. So I'm doing the opposite of subtraction. I'm going to add 1/2 to both sides. So I'll have 3/5 x on this side, the 1/2's cancel out, equals, I'll rewrite this, 3/4 plus 1/2. Rewrite this horizontally because it's easier to work with fractions horizontally. So I need a common denominator to add or subtract fractions. My common denominator of 4 and 2 can be 4. So I can take this fraction, multiply them both by 2, and I rewrite that as 3/4 plus 2/4, which gives me 5/4. And I still have 3/5 x on the other side of the equation. Just bring everything else down. Now this is the step where I need to divide by a fraction, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to multiply both sides by the reciprocal of 3/5 to get rid of it. So I multiply 5/4 times 3/5. These cancel out. I have x on the left. On the right, you can multiply straight across and get 15 on top and 20 on bottom. You can also cross cancel. When you multiply, you can cross cancel. That means the 5's can both be divided by 5. I can cross them out. Technically a 1 goes there. I replace them with a 1 because I'm dividing them both by 5, like you're simplifying. And so on top I have 1 times 3, which is 3, and on the bottom I have 4 times 1, which is 4. And always double check your final answer. If it can be simplified, you need to simplify it, but 3/4 is my final answer. So that's how you multiply by the reciprocal to solve simple one-step equations. It's done usually at the last step of the problem when you would be dividing to get x by itself. Instead of dividing by a fraction, we multiply by the reciprocal of that fraction.